Before the first slivers of dawn touched the sky, before the thick warmth of Lagos morning humidity stifled the air, and before the streets reverberated with a chorus of honking taxis and crowded footsteps, Olajumoke was already standing on her usual spot, an unremarkable slab of cracked concrete outside the towering glass doors of the bank. The city around her was waking up in its usual frenzy, a swirl of motion and noise. Yet she remained as still as the stone beneath her feet. The air smelled faintly of exhaust fumes and street food, spicy, fried plantains and warm, greasy donuts. The distant hum of the traffic mixed with the early call of a lone hawker's voice, but Olajumoke didn't hear them. She only listened to the beat of her own heart, the quiet rhythm that had accompanied her for decades. She stood with her head slightly tilted, watching the bank's doors like a woman watching the sea, hopeful, patient, unwavering. She wasn't waiting for just anyone. She wasn't there for the constant parade of businesspeople rushing by with their hurried strides, briefcases, and earbuds that drowned out the world. No, she waited for someone. She always did. She stood there every single morning, even when the heat made her skin sticky, even when the cold wind sent shivers through her fragile bones. Her clothes were simple, faded, clothes that had lived many lives, woven with the threads of time. A plain brown wrapper around her waist, her faded blue blouse, and a scarf loosely wrapped around her neck to protect herself from the harsh winds that whipped through the city. Her sandals, worn and cracked at the edges, scraped against the ground with every small shift of weight. But her back, although bent from years of labor, was straight. There was a quiet dignity in her posture, a dignity that time could not erase, even as it slowly wore away at her body. Her eyes, though tired, gleamed with a quiet purpose. And though her frame was frail, her resolve was not. As the bustling crowd passed her by, none took more than a passing glance at the figure standing on the sidewalk. Most just assumed she was one of the forgotten old women who had nowhere else to be. Yet there was something in her stillness that set her apart. There was a story, a reason for her vigil. But the city was too busy to care. The sound of heels clicking against the pavement grew louder as a woman walked past Olajumoke, heading into the bank. Her briefcase swung with an urgency that mirrored the pace of the city that had no time for pause or reflection. Olajumoke's eyes followed the woman, her gaze never wavering from the glass doors. Her lips parted, almost as if to speak, but she remained silent as always. She had been here for weeks, maybe longer. The exact number of days blurred, but she had been standing in this same spot, each day, waiting for the same thing. People didn't ask. People didn't stop. She wasn't asking for help or charity, she wasn't even asking for acknowledgement. She only waited. The familiar faces that came through the door every morning meant something to her, something deep and buried, but only she knew what it was. Olajumoke's heart would rise and fall with each step someone took towards the bank, each time the glass doors opened with that mechanical hiss. She never rushed. She never moved. Her feet, though sore, were bound to the earth with a weight heavier than any exhaustion. She stood there, a quiet observer in a world that moved too fast for her to follow. The young men passing by in their crisply ironed suits didn't notice her. The young women, their heels clicking sharply against the sidewalk, didn't see her either. The air was too full of their own urgent dreams, their own aspirations to stop and wonder about the old woman with the weathered skin and the sorrowful eyes. Olajumoke wasn't alone, not really. She had lived long enough to know that people never fully knew each other. They never saw past the surface, the quick judgments, the labels, the assumptions. No one ever asked why she stood outside the bank, and no one ever wondered if she had a reason. They only saw her as a fixture in the backdrop of their own busy lives. But there was more to her than the city ever cared to look at. Hero setup. Olajumoke is a woman of years, a 70-year-old widow whose life, like the city she lives in, has weathered its fair share of storms. Her body is frail, bent from the weight of time, yet her presence remains undiminished. There is a quiet strength in her, an unspoken resilience forged by the years of hardship, loss, and sacrifice. Olajumoke's days are marked by routine and solitude. Her children are scattered across different parts of the world, and the small house she once shared with her husband now stands empty, save for the faded memories it holds within its walls. She lives a life of quiet repetition. Her home, though once full of love and laughter, has become a place of stillness, empty but for the photographs of a life she no longer fully remembers. But in the small rituals of her daily life, there is something more. There is a sense of purpose that no one, not even the rush of Lagos, can erase. She doesn't just wait for time to pass. She waits for a moment, one fleeting moment, that she knows will come. She waits for it each day as the world moves around her, unaware. The city calls her an old woman, but she is much more than that. She is a woman who carries years of wisdom in her bones, a woman who holds the echoes of a life once lived in full. The bank, the place where she stands each day, represents a tether to the past, a symbol of something lost, perhaps even something stolen. What exactly that something is, only Olajumoke knows. And so she waits. Before now, Olajumoke's life wasn't always this way. Her memory drifts back to the days when the world felt lighter, filled with possibilities. She remembers the first time she and Adewale had moved into their little house. It was small, just a one-room building on the outskirts of Lagos, but it was theirs. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and that made everything seem possible. The walls of the house were made from red brick, still soft and smooth to the touch, and the roof was a patchwork of corrugated iron sheets. It leaked during the heavy rains, but the warmth from their love and their shared dreams kept the house from feeling cold. Olajumoke's children were young then, running around barefoot in the yard, laughing and playing. The sound of their voices, shrill with the joy of youth, echoed through the small space, bouncing off the walls and filling the air with life. It was a home, a place where love was shared in simple moments. It was in the smell of freshly baked yam that filled the kitchen in the mornings, the crackling of the firewood that Adewale used to cook the evening meals, and the way the children's voices could be heard as they ran in and out of the house. She would sit on the porch with Adewale after a long day, both of them watching the sun dip below the horizon. His hands were always rough from working the market, but his smile was always soft, full of warmth. They would sit in silence, with only the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of Lagos in the background. Their little world was simple, but it was full. But time, as it often does, changed everything. One fateful morning, Olajumoke woke up to find Adewale lying still beside her in bed, his once sturdy chest now cold. The doctors said it was a stroke, sudden and without warning. In a matter of seconds, her world had tilted. The weight of his absence was like a heavy stone pressing on her chest. She had never known such stillness before. The house, once alive with laughter and movement, now felt vacant. Every corner held the echo of Adewale's voice. Every piece of furniture seemed to carry his memory. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and the children, though they came back now and then, had their own lives to lead. They grew up, moved to different parts of the country, found jobs, married. The distance between Olajumoke and her children grew, not just in miles but in understanding. They were busy with their own struggles, their own lives. And Olajumoke, though proud of them, was left behind, alone in the small house that once felt full. Her once vibrant home had become a place of solitude. The laughter of her children, now only a distant memory, no longer filled the space. She would sit by the window at night, watching the lights of the city blink far off in the distance, and feel the absence in her chest like an aching wound. The photographs on the wall were all that remained of the life she once knew, their wedding photo, the picture of the children on their first day of school, the family photo with Adewale's arm around her shoulders, all frozen in time. Her hands would trace the edges of the photos, the glass now cracked and worn from years of handling. She would close her eyes and remember the days when the walls had felt alive, the air thick with the smells of family, the house warm with the sound of shared stories and laughter. And then there were the prayer beads. The small wooden beads that Adewale had once bought for her on their trip to the market many years ago. He had told her they were for protection, a charm to keep her safe. She had laughed then, thinking the trinket unnecessary, but after he died, she held them close. She began to clutch them every day, running her fingers over the smooth wood, feeling the grain beneath her fingers as she prayed silently for strength to keep going, for something to fill the quiet void. Now, the prayer beads were worn, the wood darkened by time and use. The beads had become part of her, a constant companion in the stillness of her days. She kept them in her pocket, next to her heart, a reminder of a life that had been, and the person who had once made her feel whole. In the quiet corners of her small house, Olajimok's life is steeped in the echoes of a past that refuses to fade. Each day, she lives surrounded by memories, some of joy, some of pain, but all of them tangled together in a web of love, loss, and resilience. The past may weigh heavily on her, but it is also what keeps her moving forward, holding on to whatever small hope remains. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the air seemed to pause, just for a moment, under the shade of the old tree near the bank. Olajimok had seen the tree countless times before, its leaves rustling gently in the wind as though whispering secrets of the world, secrets she had long forgotten to ask about. But on this day, as she stood there waiting, something was different. She felt a presence, a subtle shift in the air, like a soft breath had been blown into her life, stirring the stillness around her. A young man, Michael, passed by, just as he always did, but this time, something caught her eye. He was in his 30s, dressed in a crisp, navy blue shirt and black slacks, his shoes polished to a shine that reflected the early sunlight. But it wasn't his appearance that caught Olajimok's attention. It was the warmth of his smile. It wasn't just a smile, it was something deeper, a kindness that seemed to radiate from him, something rare and bright in the harsh hustle of the city. For a moment, she felt as though the world had paused, just as she had. Their eyes met, and he smiled again, this time more directly at her. It was a smile that held no judgment, no pity, just pure warmth. Olajimok's heart skipped, and for the briefest second, she felt a connection, a thread that reached out from his heart to hers. She had been standing there for so long, a silent observer of the city's rush, but in that moment, she was seen. "Good afternoon, Auntie," he said, his voice gentle, with an undertone of respect, as though he knew she was not just any old woman standing on the street. Olajimok, startled by his attention, smiled back, a little unsure. "Afternoon, young man," she replied, her voice raspy from the years of silence, but there was something in it, something that made him pause, to linger for a moment longer. He didn't leave immediately, as most people did. Instead, he stood there, as if waiting for something. She glanced down at the small, battered thermos in her hand, the one she had been sipping from for the past hour, and then back at him. "I'm Michael," he said, extending his hand with a kind smile. "I work just over there." He gestured toward the bank, the building towering above them, imposing yet cold. "I'm Olajimok," she replied, hesitating at first, but then shaking his hand. Her skin felt dry against his, but the warmth of his touch lingered with her. From that day forward, Michael passed by her more often, never in a rush, always with a brief greeting and a small, kind smile. Each day, his presence became a little brighter, like the sun inching its way above the horizon. One day, Michael surprised her with a small cup of warm tea from a nearby vendor, the steam curling into the air like a soft sigh. "I thought you might like something warm," he said, his voice full of genuine care. Olajimok didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to such kindness, especially from someone so much younger than her. She had expected to be overlooked, to be dismissed as just another old woman on the street. But Michael's attention felt different. It felt like a door opening to something she hadn't realized she was waiting for. As they sat under the tree, Olajimok found herself talking about things she hadn't spoken of in years, about Adewale, about the children who had grown distant, about the ache of loneliness that had quietly taken root in her heart. She had not realized how long it had been since she had spoken these words aloud, and yet, here she was, sharing them with a man she had just met. Michael listened with an openness that made her feel heard, not pitied. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer empty words of comfort. He simply listened, and that was enough. He shared small stories of his own, a childhood spent in a small village, a mother who still cooked his favorite meal whenever he visited, dreams of starting his own business one day. They spoke of simple things, and yet, in their simplicity, they found something beautiful. Olajimok noticed how the weight of her loneliness began to feel a little lighter each day. She started to look forward to Michael's visits, the small moments of connection that began to fill the emptiness that had clung to her for so long. His visits were brief, but they became the highlight of her days, the reason she woke up with a quiet anticipation. She had learned to move through life with the shadows of her past, her loss, her loneliness, her quiet sorrow. But in the space between their words, in the silences that passed between them like unspoken understanding, she began to feel a warmth return to her heart. The hope she had long since given up on began to take root again, slow and tentative, but real. She began to look forward to the mornings, not just because of the routine of waiting, but because she knew Michael would be there, a bright spot in the midst of the chaos. And with each passing day, their friendship blossomed. The once heavy silence in Olajimoke's life was now filled with the soft hum of shared moments, kindness, laughter, and the simple joy of someone caring. Michael's presence, though small in the grand scheme of her life, had reignited something in Olajimoke, a spark of connection she thought she had lost forever. The world outside continued to rush by, as it always did, but in that small corner of the city, under the shade of the old tree, Olajimoke found something she hadn't known she was waiting for, a sense of being seen, of being valued, and of being a part of something again. And for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of her solitude lift, even if just for a little while. Over the next few weeks, Michael became a familiar presence in Olajimoke's life, a steady rhythm she began to rely on. Each morning, as the sun peeked over the city skyline, she would find him walking past, a smile on his face, a nod to greet her. The early conversations they'd shared slowly morphed into longer, deeper exchanges. They began to sit together more often, the world buzzing around them as they shared cups of tea and stories of their lives. Michael brought her small gifts, a loaf of bread from the bakery down the street, soft cloth to mend her fraying clothes, or a packet of herbal tea wrapped in brown paper. Each offering was simple, but it made Olajimoke feel something she hadn't felt in years, seen, cared for. It was a kindness that warmed her heart, made her chest feel a little less heavy. Sometimes he would tell her about his dreams, how he wanted to start his own small business, perhaps open a cafe, and serve the same tea he brought her each day. His ambitions were bright and filled with the kind of hope that seemed endless, yet the more he spoke, the more she wondered if his dreams, so full of life and color, could fit in the small, worn world she had built for herself. The truth was, she had begun to look forward to his visits. There was a quiet thrill in her heart when she saw him walking down the street, his footsteps purposeful, his gaze lighting up as he neared her. He made her feel alive again, like she wasn't just waiting for the world to pass her by, but actually living in it. Yet, in the small, unspoken spaces between their conversations, a shadow began to grow. Olajimoke knew she couldn't ignore it. She had lived long enough to recognize the difference between genuine affection and something less pure. Her friends from the old neighborhood had begun to notice, and their warnings came like quiet ripples through the calm of her days. Nkechi, her oldest friend, was the first to say something. She had always been the one to speak her mind, her sharpness softened only by years of shared history. Olajimoke, Nkechi said one afternoon, pulling her aside after seeing Michael pass by with a small gift tucked under his arm. "Be careful, my child. The young ones, they see things in us that they cannot have. They take from us, and when they are done, they leave us with nothing but the remnants of what they've used." Olajimoke didn't want to hear it. She trusted Michael, trusted the kindness he showed her, the way he listened when she spoke, the way he made her feel seen and understood. She trusted the small acts of care, the tea, the bread, the simple moments that had slowly healed some of the invisible wounds she had carried for years. But Nkechi was insistent. "Gold that shines too bright can burn your hand," she said, her voice soft but heavy with warning. "You know the ways of the world. These young men, they see us as stepping stones, a way to move forward. Don't let yourself become one of their forgotten stories." Olajimoke felt a pang in her chest, a slight tightening of the heart. She had heard these warnings before, not just from Nkechi, but from others in the neighborhood, voices that were drowned out by the warmth Michael had brought into her life. But the more she thought about it, the more a small, gnawing doubt began to take root in her mind. She had lived a life full of sacrifice, loss, and pain. And now, for the first time in so many years, someone was offering her a moment of light, a chance at connection, however fleeting it might be. She didn't want to believe that Michael could be like the others, someone who took without giving. But even as she tried to reassure herself, the warning lingered in her mind. What was it that Michael wanted from her, really? What if her trust was misplaced? Despite her misgivings, the warmth of his smile and the ease with which he spoke to her kept her tethered to him. The pull of his presence, his energy, was undeniable. She had long since stopped questioning how or why she had come to depend on him. She just knew that, in this small corner of Lagos, she had found something she had almost given up on: hope. Michael's visits became more frequent, and their connection deepened. They spent hours talking under the shade of the tree, sharing their lives, their dreams, and their fears. She felt her loneliness slipping away, like an old, tattered coat she could finally shed. But with each passing day, the feeling that something wasn't quite right, that something was being left unsaid, grew stronger. Olajumoke knew she should be cautious. She knew that love, whether real or imagined, could be as much a source of pain as it could be of joy. But the joy of her newfound friendship, her connection with Michael, was too sweet to let go. So, she kept her doubts buried deep in the quiet recesses of her heart, and allowed herself to believe that this time, just maybe, it would be different. Yet, with each thoughtful gift, each shared cup of tea, each quiet moment in the shade, the tension between trust and caution stretched tighter, threatening to snap. Olajumoke could feel the pull of it, as if the world around her was holding its breath, waiting for her to make a choice. Would she trust, or would she let fear cloud the warmth Michael had brought into her life? She didn't know. She only knew that, for now, she couldn't bring herself to stop hoping. And that hope, as fragile as it was, felt like the only thing worth holding on to. It started like any other morning. Olajumoke awoke early, as she always did, her small home filled with the faint light of the early sun. The air was still, the city still asleep beneath the coolness of the dawn. She sat in the quiet of her room for a moment, collecting herself, and then dressed in her usual clothes. She brushed her hair slowly, as the days felt longer, the years heavier on her shoulders. But today was different. Today, Michael was supposed to visit her. She had been waiting for hours by the old tree near the bank, her eyes scanning the crowd as people passed by in their usual hurry. The familiar sight of Michael's warm smile was missing. He didn't show up. The minutes stretched into hours, and with each passing one, her stomach grew tighter, her heart heavier. It wasn't like him to be late. He was always punctual, always with the same steady, calm presence. But today, there was only the sharp sting of absence. She told herself it was nothing. Perhaps something had kept him, perhaps work had been overwhelming. She waited a little longer, clutching the small bag of tea she had set aside for him, a token of their shared moments. But as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a golden hue across the pavement, her unease grew. He never came. And so, against her better judgment, she rose from her seat, the weight of her worry heavy in her chest. She walked slowly toward the bank, hoping to see him there. When she arrived, the bank's glass doors were shut tight, the usual buzz of activity missing. The guards, usually quick to acknowledge the comings and goings of the regulars, didn't even glance her way. Her heart sank. It felt wrong. Something was wrong. She stood there for a long moment, uncertainty closing in around her like the walls of the city itself. When the guards finally turned their backs, she caught a few words of their conversation, trying to make sense of the silence. The words drifted toward her, half-heard, until one sentence struck like a bolt of lightning, shattering her thoughts. "Did you hear? Michael's been promoted," one guard said, the words crisp and matter-of-fact. "That's not all," the other replied, his voice low. "He's gone and taken that old woman's money. Used her to get what he wanted. Poor thing doesn't even know. She's nothing but an old fool who can't see when she's being used." Olajumoke froze. The words hit her like a slap to the face. Her legs trembled, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse on the spot. She tried to speak, but her voice failed her. The ground beneath her seemed to shift, as though the very earth she stood on was crumbling away. Used her? Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the words. The gentle kindness, the laughter, the small gifts, had it all been a lie? Had Michael only been pretending to care, to be her friend, to share in her life, just to steal from her? The tears came, sharp and fast, clouding her vision. She reached instinctively for the small prayer beads that she carried with her always, the beads that had comforted her through years of loneliness, of loss. But now, they felt like nothing more than a cruel reminder of the truth she had tried to ignore. She stood there, her body trembling, clutching the beads in her hands, her fingers numb as the reality of the betrayal sunk deep into her heart. How could she have been so blind? The man who had brought her tea, who had made her laugh, who had promised her that the loneliness she carried was not a permanent thing, had used her, taken her trust, and disappeared when he no longer needed it. Her hands were shaking, the beads slipping through her fingers like sand, and she couldn't breathe. The weight of the loss crushed her chest, making it impossible to catch her breath. Everything had been a lie. The thought echoed over and over in her mind, the sting sharp and unforgiving. She had trusted him. She had believed in the goodness of his heart. She had felt his presence fill the emptiness inside her, but now, all of it felt like a cruel joke. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the pavement, the weight of betrayal dragging her down like an anchor to the depths of despair. She didn't care who saw her, she didn't care if the whole world watched as she fell apart. The tears came in a flood now, hot and uncontrollable. How had she let this happen? She thought of the many years she had lived, the lessons she had learned, the quiet strength she had built from all the pain she had endured. But in the face of Michael's betrayal, none of that seemed to matter. All her wisdom, all her experiences, felt like nothing more than hollow echoes in the face of the reality that had just shattered her. The street around her continued to buzz with the usual noise, cars honking, people shouting, the rhythm of the city that never stopped. But to Olajimoke, it felt like all the sound had gone silent, leaving only the ache in her chest and the coldness in her hands. She couldn't stop shaking, couldn't stop the tears. How could she have been so blind? The prayer beads slipped from her grasp, rolling onto the ground, and she didn't bother to pick them up. It felt as though everything she had once held dear had been taken from her. The kindness, the hope, the connection, everything had been shattered in an instant. She had been used. And now, there was nothing left but the raw, bleeding pain of it. The world kept turning, but Olajimoke remained motionless, frozen in a moment of heartbreak. In the days that followed the crushing betrayal, Olajimoke withdrew into herself. The anger, the sorrow, the sting of betrayal, they all twisted together into a knot in her chest, but in the silence that followed, something else began to take shape. She had always been a survivor. Her mind, sharp and observant, had carried her through the hardest of times. And while she no longer had the physical strength to confront Michael or the world directly, she had something far more dangerous: her ability to think, to plan, to outmaneuver. She began to work quietly, unnoticed by the busy world around her. The bank was her first target. She had spent so many years visiting it, speaking with the tellers, getting to know the system, learning the language of money and accounts. The very system that had been used against her could now be turned back on itself. Her old friend, Ngozi, who had worked in the banking sector for decades, was the first person she sought out. Ngozi had always been a quiet figure in Olajimoke's life, one who had seen more of the world than anyone would care to know. Olajimoke trusted her, and when she reached out, Ngozi was quick to respond. "Olajimoke, you should have told me sooner. We'll get to the bottom of this, I promise," Ngozi said when they met at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. Ngozi, a woman of few words but immense knowledge, had always had a way of cutting through the noise, and Olajimoke could feel that old spark of trust flare up again. Together, they reviewed the details, carefully combing through Olajimoke's bank statements. Ngozi knew the system inside and out, and her eyes flicked over the papers with ease, her mind sharp as a blade. Slowly, with each transaction, a pattern emerged. Michael had siphoned off small amounts at first, easy to miss, but over time, they had grown larger. Funds had been transferred into accounts that didn't belong to her, transactions masked with clever timing and false justifications. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became. Michael hadn't just taken a few pennies here and there. No, he had been biding his time, using her for access to her savings. The more Olajimoke studied the records, the more the evidence mounted. She could see the strings he had pulled, the small manipulations that had once seemed innocent, now unmistakably dark. With Ngozi's help, Olajimoke filed a formal complaint with the bank. They demanded an immediate investigation into Michael's actions. Olajimoke didn't need to shout or scream. She didn't need to make a scene. She knew how to wait, how to play the long game. All she needed to do was place the truth in front of them and let it speak for itself. Days passed, and the waiting was agonizing. But Olajimoke was patient. She had learned long ago that the world moved at its own pace, indifferent to her suffering. But she also knew that in time, the truth had a way of emerging, like the sun breaking through the darkest clouds. She didn't rush. She didn't push. Each day, she revisited her files, each transaction, each detail. Every time her fingers traced the numbers on the page, she could feel the weight of what she had uncovered. It was an invisible power, quiet but undeniable. The truth was on her side, and that was enough. Olajimoke's mind worked tirelessly, quietly assembling her case. The evidence was irrefutable, and she knew that soon, the bank would have no choice but to take action. Michael had used her trust to line his pockets, but now the tables were turning. At night, when she sat alone in her home, she would hold the prayer beads once more. But this time, she didn't hold them out of desperation or sadness. She held them with resolve, with purpose. The beads, once a symbol of her heartache, now became a reminder of the strength she had inside, strength she had forgotten until now. This wasn't the end for Olajimoke. It was the beginning of something else, a quiet, calculated rise from the ashes of betrayal. She would not let Michael's deceit define her. She would not let him walk away with what he had stolen. She would stand tall, even in the face of this injustice, and she would make him answer for what he had done. The world outside may have been oblivious, but Olajimoke was no longer a passive observer. She was a woman with a plan that would bring her justice. And as she sat there, her fingers brushing over the smooth beads, she made a vow to herself. She would rise stronger from this. She wouldn't let anyone take what was hers again. She was ready. The day of reckoning arrived swiftly. The investigation into Michael's fraudulent activities had gained momentum, and the truth, once buried under the layers of his deceit, was now laid bare for everyone to see. The bank, forced to act under the weight of the overwhelming evidence, called for an emergency meeting. The building that had once felt like a fortress of power and control now felt like a stage for the inevitable fall. Olajimoke, sitting in a modest cafe across the street, watched as the day unfolded. She wasn't in the boardroom, wasn't standing in the spotlight. No, she had chosen to remain distant from the spectacle, preferring to observe from the shadows where she had always been forced to live her life. The heavy curtains of her quiet life had been drawn back, revealing the truth to everyone, and she didn't need to be front and center to feel the victory. Inside the bank, Michael's confident facade began to crumble. He had always been so sure of himself. His charm, his way of talking, the facade of kindness he wore so effortlessly. But now, with every word from the investigation, every piece of evidence revealed, his arrogance began to falter. His colleagues, who once greeted him with smiles and polite words, now exchanged glances filled with suspicion and disbelief. Michael, the man they had trusted, the man who had appeared so honorable, was exposed for what he truly was, a fraud. The air was tense. A crowd of bank employees had gathered, drawn to the dramatic confrontation. Michael stood at the center, his back straight at first, but with every new accusation, his posture weakened, his hands trembling. His smooth words, once so convincing, now fell flat. There was no more hiding, no more manipulating the narrative. The evidence was irrefutable, and the truth, like a flood, washed away all the lies. His colleagues, some of whom had once been his allies, now watched in stunned silence. Michael's polished exterior, the very thing that had made him seem untouchable, cracked open like glass under the pressure. He had no answers, no excuses left. His confidence, once unshakable, dissolved into panic and shame. The room was filled with whispers, the sound of shock rippling through the group. And then came the final blow, the bank's decision. Michael, once the promising young man with the world at his feet, was escorted out of the building by security guards, his head hung low, his body slumped in defeat. The man who had once held all the power now walked through the front doors in disgrace, a broken shell of the person he had pretended to be. Outside, Olajimoke watched quietly, the faintest hint of triumph in her heart, but not the joy she had expected. She had won, yes, but the taste of victory was not sweet. It was quiet, subtle, and layered with the weight of everything she had endured. She had regained her dignity, reclaimed what was hers, but there was no satisfaction in seeing Michael fall. His downfall didn't change the fact that she had trusted him, had allowed herself to believe in the kindness he had shown her. It didn't undo the pain she had felt when she realized how thoroughly he had used her. It didn't take away the years of loneliness that had preceded him, or the quiet ache of betrayal that still lingered in her chest. But what it did give her was the peace of knowing that the truth had prevailed. Michael had been exposed for who he truly was. His lies, his deceit, could no longer hold any weight. The world would know the truth now, and there was power in that. As Michael disappeared from sight, escorted away from the bank in humiliation, Olajimoke sat in silence, her fingers resting lightly on the beads that had once been a symbol of her heartache, but now felt like a quiet affirmation of her resilience. She had faced the worst of what he could do to her, and she had survived. The shame that he had tried to impose on her, the manipulation, the betrayal, it was all undone. She didn't need to watch the crowd gather, didn't need to be part of the scene. The truth had been exposed, and in that quiet moment, Olajimoke felt the smallest shift inside her. A sense of vindication, of justice, that didn't come with fanfare but with a quiet, deep knowing that she had not been defeated. She had stood her ground, and in the end, the truth was her greatest weapon. The world had not crushed her, nor had it taken everything from her. She had taken back what was hers. The silence in her chest had finally given way to a peaceful strength, and as she stood, leaving the cafe and walking down the busy Lagos street, she knew this was the beginning of something new, a new chapter where her life was no longer defined by betrayal, but by her own quiet, unwavering resolve. The months that followed Michael's downfall were quiet for Olajimoke, but they were not empty. The weight of the betrayal still lingered in the corners of her mind, like a shadow she couldn't quite shake off, but life, as it always does, moved forward. She no longer stood by the bank every day, waiting for a presence that would never come. Her routine, once built around Michael's visits and the small comfort he brought, had to be rewritten, rebuilt from the ground up. The empty spaces in her life, once filled with his lies, now found room for something else. New connections, small acts of kindness, and the realization that she had not been forgotten. Slowly, she began to open herself up to the people around her once again. She began to see the familiar faces in her neighborhood with new eyes, those who had always been there, offering warmth and quiet support in ways that had never demanded anything in return. Among those people was Miriam, an older woman who had always looked out for Olajimoke from a distance. Miriam had lived in the neighborhood for as long as Olajimoke could remember. She was one of the first to greet her when she moved into the area all those years ago, and over time, the two had exchanged pleasantries, but their relationship had always been one of polite acquaintance. Until now. One afternoon, after the dust of Michael's betrayal had settled, Miriam came to visit. Her arrival was unexpected but not unwelcome. She arrived with a small basket, as she often did when she came to visit friends, filled with fresh fruit and baked goods she had made that morning. Olajimoke was sitting quietly on her porch, the weight of the past still heavy on her shoulders, but it was lightened by the softness of the breeze and the sense that the world was finally beginning to feel like a place of peace. "Olajimoke," Miriam said, her voice warm and kind as she approached. "I've been thinking about you. You've been through so much, my dear. I thought it was time I came by." Olajimoke smiled softly, the lines of her face relaxed for the first time in weeks. "Miriam, I didn't expect you to come today. But I'm glad you did." The two women sat together, sharing the fruit and tea Miriam had brought. It was a simple act, but in its simplicity, it felt like a lifeline. As they ate and talked, the conversation flowed easily, stories of their childhoods, memories of times long gone, and the quiet joys that still kept them going. Olajimoke realized, as she spoke with Miriam, that she had missed this kind of companionship. The kind that required no pretense, no expectations, just the shared comfort of knowing that someone understood. Over the next few weeks, their bond grew stronger. Miriam would visit often, bringing food or helping Olajimoke with errands. In turn, Olajimoke would sit with Miriam for hours, listening to her wisdom, her stories, and the quiet strength that seemed to emanate from her. Miriam had lived a full life, one that had been filled with both joy and sorrow, and yet she carried her years with grace, never weighed down by the burdens she had endured. As their friendship deepened, Olajimoke began to understand the quiet power of connection. It wasn't about grand gestures or promises of change. It was about the small, everyday moments, the shared cups of tea, the unspoken understanding, the feeling that she wasn't alone in the world. For the first time since Adewale's passing, Olajimoke began to feel like her life had meaning again, not because of what she had lost, but because of what she had found in Miriam and in the other people around her. Miriam, too, seemed to find solace in their companionship. She spoke often of her own loneliness, of the years spent in isolation, but there was no bitterness in her words, only the acceptance that came with time. Together, they found a quiet joy in each other's company, a joy that felt gentle and enduring. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset from Olajimoke's porch, Miriam turned to her with a soft smile. "You know, Olajimoke, life is full of changes. Sometimes we don't get to choose what happens, but we can choose how we face it. And you, my dear, have faced more than anyone should. But you're still here. You're still standing." Olajimoke looked at her friend, her heart swelling with a quiet gratitude. Miriam's words were simple, but they carried weight. For the first time in months, Olajimoke realized that she didn't need to stand alone. She didn't need to carry the burden of the past by herself. There were people in her life, people like Miriam, who would help her bear it, who would share in her quiet victories and her losses, and that made all the difference. The loss of Michael's deceitful presence had opened the door to something unexpected, a real, lasting connection with someone who had no hidden agenda, no ulterior motives. Miriam didn't want anything from Olajimoke except her company, and in that simplicity, Olajimoke found a kind of healing she had never known before. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, Olajimoke felt like she could face it with a quiet strength. The storm of betrayal had passed, and now, with Miriam by her side, she could see that there was still warmth in the world, still room for joy, for companionship, for hope. As they sat together, their cups of tea growing cold as the sun dipped below the horizon, Olajimoke realized that life, though imperfect, still held moments of beauty. The past might never fully leave her, but the future no longer seemed as daunting. With Miriam, she had found a new kind of peace, a peace built not on forgetting, but on the strength to move forward. And so, in the stillness of the evening as the world around them quieted, Olajimoke allowed herself to let go of the past, just for a moment. She let the warmth of the tea, the sound of Miriam's laughter, and the promise of new beginnings fill her heart with a quiet, tender hope. It wasn't the end, but it was a new beginning. And that was enough. The afternoon sun bathed the small room in a golden warmth, casting long shadows on the walls of Olajimoke's home. The air was still, save for the faint sounds of the bustling city just outside. The rhythm of life in Lagos continued, but in this quiet corner of her world, there was peace, a peace she hadn't known in years. Olajimoke had invited Miriam over for a simple meal, a small token of gratitude for the companionship and support that had helped her heal. The two women sat together, the table set with bowls of steaming yam porridge, warm and comforting. The food, simple as it was, felt like a feast to Olajimoke's heart, a celebration of the bond they had formed, a bond that had slowly filled the empty spaces in her life. As they ate, they spoke of many things, of their families, of the days gone by, of the future that felt a little brighter with each passing day. Miriam, always the wise one, listened with a quiet attentiveness that made Olajimoke feel as though her words mattered, as though she, too, had something important to say. When the meal was over, Olajimoke stood and walked to a small cabinet near the wall. From within, she retrieved a small box, carefully wrapped in soft cloth. She opened it slowly, revealing a gold necklace, a simple yet elegant piece, with a pendant that caught the light as it glinted softly. Miriam looked at the necklace, her eyes widening in surprise. "For you," Olajimoke said, her voice gentle. "A small gift, a symbol of everything you've given me, the support, the love, the friendship that has helped me find my way again." Miriam's hands trembled as she reached out to accept the necklace. She hadn't expected this, and the gesture moved her deeply. "Olajimoke, No, Miriam," Olajimoke interrupted softly. "It's a small token, but it means everything to me. You helped me see that I wasn't alone. That even in the darkest moments, there was still light to be found." Miriam nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She hadn't asked for anything in return, yet here was Olajimoke, offering her a piece of her heart, wrapped in gold and tenderness. The two women sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history and quiet understanding filling the room. Outside, the city continued its dance of noise and movement, but in this small, humble space, Olajimoke felt as though time had stopped. She had come a long way, from the sharp sting of betrayal to this moment of peace. The past no longer felt as heavy. It was no longer a burden. It was a story, a chapter that had helped shape the woman she had become. As the sun began to set, casting a warm orange glow over the city, Olajimoke stood and walked to the window. She looked out over Lagos, the vast, sprawling city she had called home for so many years. The streets were still filled with life, with people rushing from one place to another, their lives moving in a blur of activity. But for Olajimoke, everything felt different now. The weight of the years, the pain of loss and betrayal, had finally begun to slip off her shoulders. She had been through so much grief, betrayal, loneliness, but she had emerged stronger. She had not been broken. No, she had survived. And in that survival, she had found something more important than she had ever realized: peace. The bank, once a place of torment and sorrow, was no longer a source of pain. It had become something else entirely, a symbol of her resilience. It was a reminder that even in the face of betrayal, there could still be hope. There could still be redemption. As the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, Olajimoke felt a quiet sense of closure. The storm had passed, and in its wake, she had found something beautiful, a new connection, a new beginning. Miriam's presence in her life had given her the strength to move forward, to let go of the past and embrace the future. She wasn't just a silent watcher anymore. She wasn't defined by the betrayal that had once shaken her to her core. She was a woman who had faced the darkest days and had come out the other side stronger, more resolute. In her survival, she had found a quiet victory. With a deep, steady breath, Olajimoke turned away from the window and looked back at her friend. "Thank you, Miriam," she whispered, "for everything." Miriam smiled softly, the kind of smile that spoke volumes, full of understanding and quiet pride. "We are never truly alone, Olajimoke. We carry the strength of those who stand beside us." And in that moment, surrounded by the soft hum of life in Lagos, Olajimoke knew that she had found her peace. She had survived, and in that survival she had rediscovered hope. As the night fell, the stars twinkling softly above, Olajimoke allowed herself to let go of the past. She let the warmth of the evening, the closeness of Miriam's friendship, and the promise of new beginnings fill her heart with quiet joy. The future was still uncertain, but she knew she could face it, step by step, with strength and with peace. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready for whatever lay ahead.